directors and was asked to work with the education department. And President Lloyd asked me if I would specifically work with Zoom meetings to provide more educational opportunities for us during these times of COVID sort of separation, and stamp shows weren't really happening, but now it looks like we're going to have an opportunity to do both of these events by going to stamp shows safely and by continuing to have the Zoom meetings. Being new to the board and really pretty new to AFDCS, as far as I think I joined in 2010, that you know, getting to know people has been vital in the area of collecting what I'm interested in. And Bob was one of the first individuals that I learned, Bob Lewin, sitting down and just chatting while we were going through covers. And I learned a lot from him, from those initial conversations, and helped me decide where I wanted to put my dollars. Because if I hadn't bought that one particular cover, he said he would buy it. So I knew it had to be an important cover, and I better snatch it while I could. And I'm just so thankful that he agreed to do part one. We had a Zoom, for those of you that weren't able to attend, back in May, that he talked about Halverson and Laffert's covers and how their lives intersected in so much of what they did. So we thought it would be important to continue that discussion of cachet makers, because that's really who we collect. Not just the topic of the stamp, but all the individuals who have made cachets for a particular stamp that you collect. So Bob said he would be glad to do a second presentation dealing with other hand-painted cachets that were done from 1935 to 1985, which is a great time span. And so he's got somewhere around 35 different cachet makers he's going to highlight tonight. So what I want to ask you to do is just continue to mute yourself. And if you have a question about one of his presentations, cachets, or information about a cachet maker, if you'll use the chat column and make sure you're identified by name. Sometimes people put on a nickname, or you know, their name doesn't show up. But if you'll identify yourself if you're not in the chat room, and then write your question in the chat room. When Bob's done with his presentation, then Mike will go back and start with those questions from the very beginning and let Bob deal with that information at the end of his presentation. And that way we'll get through all 35 cachet makers, and we'll get to see samples of all the ones that he's collected and is going to educate us on tonight. So Bob, I'm going to turn it over to you and to Mike and say thank you to everyone for coming to this second AFDCS Education Zoom event. Thank you very much. It's all yours, Bob.
Okay, Mike, we live, there we go. Chris, let me just follow up on Chris's comment. You'll notice my email on this first slide. If you have questions of specific cachet makers or covers, please communicate with me, and that way we can both work together, perhaps learn something. But in any event, my email is there. The first thing I want to do is to thank Mark Goodson for all of the help that he gave me in preparing this presentation. Mark is probably knows more about cachet makers and first day covers than anyone that I've met. And so Mark, thank you. When I have a question, he was glad to help me. Which, by the way, if I get something wrong, you know, you can lay it on Mark. And I also want to thank all of you who responded to my request for information on Laffert covers that you had. About a dozen people responded, and it was very helpful. thank you. I would let you all know that I'm beginning to come to conclusion, particularly with the information I got from all of you, that Lafert made, it looks like 5 cachets or 5 covers for each issue, including his first. Those of you who have his Park series, 750 to 59, as his first cachet, there are only 4 sets, intact sets, that I've been able to document. And there was a 5th set made, but it's been broken up. But throughout the 20 years I've been tracking Lafert, I can document only 5 different sets that were made and only 4 that exist. Moving on, you'll notice a change in the title. This occurred because as I was putting together this presentation, several facts started coming into clarity, into focus. I picked a 50-year period. When Chris asked me to do this, I figured a 50-year period would be nice and neat. 50 years is a nice, comfortable number to work with. But then as I got to putting it together, I realized that there are events that happened in the mid-70s that created the wave, a beginning of a wave, a dawn, if you will, of the golden age of first day covers. And it only became apparent when I started putting all these cachet makers together. I'll get more to that as we get towards the end. But note that my bookends now are Dorothy Knapp and Freda Dickey Weaver. What marvelous bookends, the 2 queens of our hobby, interestingly enough, both of whom were not stamp collectors. Both of the ladies were roped into, or perhaps recruited is a better word, making cachets by their husbands, who were stamp collectors. Maxwell Knapp and John Weaver were stamp collectors, and they're the ones who convinced their wives to become cachet makers. Going on, Mike, move on to slide number 2, the next slide, please. I've chosen this as the first slide. It looks like a little bit of the right end is cut off, but that's okay. It's just a stamp. There's nothing significant there, except the cover is a little damaged because it's larger. And obviously it's actually 12 inches long. It's a large envelope. And clearly over the years, the dealers who owned it had trouble keeping it in good condition. But I'm willing to bet that none of you, unless you can read the signature in the lower left-hand corner, none of you could tell me who this was by. I didn't know who it was by when I bought it. It took me a while before I noticed the signature, which is a little bit furry, but Ethel Dickinson made this cover. And as you can see on the below the cachet, it's from the post office in St. Helena, California, to the postmaster of San Francisco. Interestingly canceled at Golden Gate Station, which is just down the road from the Golden Gate Bridge. Why this cover? The simple reason being that I'm coming to the conclusion that there may very well be more art on covers, both painted and not painted, but art on covers. There may very well be more that we don't know about than we do go about. And I'll give you some more numbers. But the bottom line with this cover is that there are covers to be discovered. And just a minor point of information, The Golden Gate, most people believe, refers to the bridge, and it does not. The Golden Gate is the entryway from the Pacific Ocean into San Francisco Bay. And the bridge is the bridge that was built to span it. But the Golden Gate is not the bridge. It's the ocean entryway, the inlet that leads into San Francisco Bay. Okay, next slide, please, Mike. Any discussion of first day covers has got to include Ralph Dyer. I talked a little bit about him on the last presentation, and I'm bringing him up again because he became a very prolific maker of hand-painted cachets. These two covers, the first one on top, 1931, is a style that Dyer used in his early cachets with a photograph, by the way. You'll note that predates Crosby. And note also the frame. Dyer's frame was a design element. He and Laffert were the only two significant cachet makers that I know of who used that frame as an artistic device. The cover on the bottom is a tinted cover that I believe was done by Dyer, but the issue with Ralph Dyer is figuring out when he actually started to hand paint cachets. Honey, can you bring the people back? Excuse me, I'm just trying to work the computer here.
Oh, shoot.
No.
All right, what do you want?
I just wanted the images of the people so I could see who I'm talking to. No? Well, all right, we'll bypass that. Dyer, as you know, worked as an artist for companies like Washington Stamp Exchange, and he primarily made his money in covers by doing design work for others. When he started to paint his own cachets is not clear, because you find in auctions that have a lot of Dyer covers, the earlier covers are generally described as from Ralph's own personal collection. So it's clear that he was not selling painted art or painted covers until much later. When he started is uncertain. Next slide, Mike. These are some Canadian covers. There was a recent article in First Days by Gary Dickinson about American cachet makers who did Canadian stamps, did Canadian covers. This cover substantially predates the Canadian cover shown in the article that was done by Ralph Dyer. Ralph did at least 15 different Canadian covers from 1937 until into the 50s. And as you can see, there's some of his most beautiful work. The loon and the bottom cover is some of the best work that I've seen of for Ralph Dyer. It would appear that these were, or at least the top cover, was done for his personal collection as it's addressed to him. So again, we don't know if he was selling any of these covers in the 30s or the 40s. Next cover, please, Mike, or next slide. It is clear that by the 50s, and the top cover is the example, Ralph was doing hand-painted cachets and selling them. And when you again go through large groups of Dyer covers, you start getting covers that are addressed to other people. This one happens to be to Mr. Jarrett, who was a well-known collector of the time. But it is clear that at least by the 50s, Dyer was very active in making hand-painted cachets. The bottom cover is from the Liberty series and shows a little bit more of his style. He could be very, very elaborate in his painting, but he did, as far as I know, all of the covers for the 1954 series. Next slide, Mike, please. The next cachet maker that began in the early 30s, and I'm sorry I didn't mention, I'll be going through all of these cachet makers primarily in chronological order based on when they started. Gladys Adler started in the early 30s. She and her daughter Florine Edmiston, often confused as Florence Edmiston, lived in Texas. Gladys lived in Bel Air, Texas, and Florine lived in San Antonio, Texas, about 200 miles apart. Unfortunately, their covers and their artwork are very similar in style, and it's difficult to identify them. And the best way to identify them, or the clearest way, is to turn them over, because almost all of them, whether done by Gladys or Florine, will have their name stamp on the back cover. Next, Mike. Now these two covers, one was done by Gladys, one was done by Florine. The one on top was done by Gladys, and it's listed in plenty. The one on the bottom was done by Florine. And the handwriting is Florine's handwriting. The interesting thing about this bottom cover is that there was a note inside that Florine wrote to her customer. And the note announced her upcoming issues and thanking the customer, of course, for their business. In it, Florine mentions that her cachets are all priced at 15 cents. She sold her cachets at 15 cents a piece. Now, if you think about it, 3 cents for the stamp, a penny for the envelope, maybe a penny for paints. Well, it's actually not a bad business model. She's got a nickel in cost and a dime in profit. And during the Depression years, that was milk money or egg money. Both Florine and Gladys were among the first to sell hand-painted art. Well, the original, or those who did hand-painted art in the 30s, Halverson never really sold his artwork. Halverson sold his handwriting. He addressed envelopes in his calligraphic style for 10 cents a cover. Laffert also was not looking for profit. I believe he sold 2 of his customers, Frost and Heiliger de Wint, but I suspect that he probably used that money to cover his costs and postage and everything for the other part of his business. Laffert was not looking to make a profit. Okay, next cachet, Mike, or next cover. These again are one cover by Gladys, the one on top, and the cover on the bottom is by Florine. Note the handwriting of the address. They're both exactly the same handwriting, and it's Florine's handwriting. This is the way that Florine addressed her covers. You'll find that style, particularly with the curls on the letters, on the capital letters. But the cover is definitely by Florine, and the top one, which has Florine's writing, has Gladys's name on the flap, actually handwritten by Gladys. So it's tough to tell these two apart, but it becomes easy if you just check the back flaps. Okay, next cover, please. Of surprising influence in my conclusion are the Ace covers that were started by Leonard Turley. I spoke about the Ace covers he started, and ACE stands for Art Cover Exchange. And Turley started his exchange program in 1934, late 1934. None of these covers were painted for profit. All of the ACE members painted for pleasure, and they exchanged covers and letters as a way of, many of them were shut-ins or otherwise confined, and it was a way of connecting with other people. Leonard Turley, in an article in First Days, indicated that during the course of the original art cover exchange, he calculated they had a membership list of over 600 members. And Turley estimated that over between 30,000 and 100,000 covers were exchanged. This is part of the reason why I suggest that there may be more hand-painted art that is as still undiscovered than what we do know. The top cover in this case was done by Leroy Hodapp. Note that he's using the entire cover for his canvas. This is one of the earliest examples I can find of anyone using an entire cover to paint, because it was against postal regulations. The address is up in the top left corner. Hodapp's address is the return address on the back. But as you know, as the genre increased over the years, cachet makers began using the entire cover. But in 1937, it was pretty much unheard of, and I find very few covers of that early vintage where more than just the left-hand side is used for the artwork. The bottom cover is by P.L. Cantrell, one of the better artists for ACE. Amazing, it's just a very bold, strong cachet. You can just have a lot of fun with this. You can imagine this fellow walking down the street, either leading a band or being a circus barker or whatever. Interestingly enough, most of the ACE covers are all individual and unique because they were written to one person. Mr. Cantrell apparently kept track of his covers and numbered them on the back. This is cover number 4 of this design. So he sent the same design to different people. And I know this to be true again because Mark Goodson has a copy of this cover slightly different than this one, but with the same design. Okay, next slide, Mike. This cover is an early one done by Dorothy Knapp. The question or primary question with Dorothy and her cachets is, when did she actually start painting? One thing that experts like Doug Weiss and other Knapp collectors agree on is that the 903 Vermont issue is not the first cachet that she painted. That conclusion is made because the art style is far more advanced than this earlier style. The 903 cachet is beginning to develop her cloud design. You see no clouds here. The interesting thing about this cover is that there are 4 examples of this design that I'm aware of, that I've seen. Doug has several of them in his book on Dorothy Knapp. But all of them are addressed to people in Rhinebeck, New York, which indicates that the 4, again, of course, it's an add-on. It was put on the cover well after the fact. We don't know when this cover was painted between 32. Well, we know it wasn't painted in 32 because Dorothy didn't marry Maxwell until 1934. So the issue is, when did she start doing her cachets? I believe this is one of her earliest ones. Doug Weiss will tell you that there is no way to determine which is the first cachet that she painted, that it's simply impossible, and I think he's got probably a good point. But this is certainly, it's an unsigned cover. Again, it's in a more primitive style, so we know it was among her early covers. Dorothy said that she started painting covers after they moved into the home that she and Maxwell bought in Rhinebeck on Livingston Street, and that was 1938. So the best suspicion, or the best guess, if you will, would be that she likely started sometime in 1938. Next slide, Mike. Thank you. This is Dorothy's more mature style. It's the style that evolved after several years, and if you can examine her covers and pretty much identify an early style, a middle period, and a later period. So by 1945, I believe both of these World War II covers were done at the time, contemporaneous. And you'll note that she has developed her cloud design, which is a separation device to artistically separate the stamp. On the top cover, you have a scroll. You'll see a lot of her covers with a scroll that is intended to do the same thing. It's a separation device to artistically separate the design from the stamp. So if you work backwards from 1945, if you're trying to determine when Dorothy started, 7 years is certainly a reasonable time to her to develop her different styles. And again, that would put us back into the late 30s as to when she started. Okay, next cover, Mike, please, or next slide. You'll notice so far that we've all been in the 30s, and a good many of the cachet makers that we'll be dealing with today started in the 30s. And interestingly enough, there's if you do a time scale of when all of these hand-colored or hand-painted artists started, you find a great deal in the 30s, and then another great deal in the 70s and 80s, and virtually very few in between. But still in the 30s, this is the California Pacific International Exposition, known as CPI. Lottie Eschliman is the artist who did this one. There were several cachet makers who started with this Pacific, the CPI Exposition in 1935. Espen Shade was another. There are several more. Crosby did his first photo cachets in 1935. And there's an interesting lesson that I'd like to pass on that this cover highlights. The cover is stone cold gorgeous. I'm willing to bet that very few of you have ever seen it. This is the Planty listed copy. It's a copy that's in Planty. So the question arises, did she do more than one? And over, again, my 25 years, I've never seen another copy of this one. It happens to come from a good friend of ours, Bonnie Fuson, of the Claude Reese chapter. I've never seen another one. And the tendency is to conclude, well, it's a Planty listed copy. No one's ever seen another one. We conclude that it's unique or one of a kind or only known copy. That would be premature in this case because on the back of the cover, Lottie again did a little numbering system and indicates that she made 12 of these, which means the other 11 are just very well hidden. Never seen them in auction. But there they are. So before we jump to conclusions, or at least the conclusion I reach for myself is when I'm making exhibits, and before I jump to conclusion that it's one of a kind, you got to be careful because, well, it's tough to tell. Next slide, please, Ken. Again, two more of Lottie's covers. The top one is done in pen and ink. It's recently undiscovered or newly discovered example of her first example. She did 4 designs for the CPI exhibition that would all be considered her first cachets. This one I've never seen it before. It's not in Planty's. And on the back, she says she made only 4. Okay, next mic, please. Walter Crosby. And it might be a little surprised that I'm including him in hand-painted art because, well, we all know that his cachets were printed in thermograph. These, however, are tinted. And Planty comments that of all the cachets that Crosby did for the 1935 exhibition, and he did a lot beside the first day of issue, he did dozens and dozens and dozens of cachets on a daily basis for the different events during the exhibition. But Planty makes a comment that most of the cachets have been seen with hand coloring. Now, when you start getting a lot of hand tinting, that doesn't indicate that it was done by one collector, because one collector wouldn't have a lot of examples in his possession to do the coloring. The question is, did Crosby do the coloring? Was he the artist? Because his artwork literally cries out for color. You go through Crosby's cachets and the artwork just cries out for color. Next slide, Mike. Note this cachet, done on August 23 for the Fleet Review. Now, Crosby made a new design. Although this cachet looks very similar to the one you saw on the last slide, note that the wings and the shield are very different. There's only 3 bars in the shield where there were 5 in the previous one. And it also says U.S. Fleet Review. So the cachet was done by Crosby specifically for the Fleet Review. Somehow it got overprinted with another cachet that was done by the Universal Ship Cancellation Society. If you look closely in the bottom left, you can start seeing the USCS. It stands for Universal Ship Cancellation Society. It could have been made by Crosby because he was very active with that society, but it's overprinted. but note that it's specifically overprinted for the Fleet Review. You look up at the top, it's for the Fleet Review, the same event that the Crosby cachet was made for. Now, I've examined this under 10 power magnification, and it appears that all of the second cachet, the light San Diego, California Fleet Review, is over the thermograph and the color that's on the Crosby cachet. The only way it can be over it is if it were already colored when it was applied on August 23, which means that the color existed and it could only have been done by Crosby, because he would not have released the cover or sold it until August 23. A little bit of analysis, perhaps Crosby did do the hand coloring. If you look at a lot of these covers, the colors are consistent throughout, indicating that they were done by one person. And of course, the most likely one is Crosby. Next one, Mike, please. This is Torkel Gundel's first. 1934. Gundel was a cachet maker, very popular for some period of time, well over 50 years. This is his first. Next slide, Mike. Gundel had a little hand press that he used to do printing. The top cover is, again, one of his early ones in 1936. But there's printing in the bottom, the Washington, D.C. and the date. Gundel did that printing himself before he did the design. His later style is shown on the bottom cover, dated 1985, 50 years after he began. Torque was around for a long time. Okay, next slide, Mike. Again, in the 30s, 1936, Henry Schulerman. Not a significant cachet maker, but a very good artist, and that's why I've included him. Notice the action and the horses. I mean, this is fairly good artwork. Schulerman only did a couple of covers. This is a new first. It predates the one that's listed in the Photo Encyclopedia of First Cachets. This is a new one, and it predates it. But I think a very nice example of good art. Okay, next, Mike. Another example of a cachet maker who only produced a few, but I'm including him because of the quality of his work. These two cachets were done by Elmer Wagner. They're done in pen and ink, both of them. And I think these are just, again, gorgeous, gorgeous cachets, well done, well executed, well designed, and something that anyone would have. I suspect Wagner probably did these for his personal pleasure rather than to sell them. Both of these are addressed to him. I only know of 2 copies of the first, of the one on top. Again, both addressed to Elmer. And the bottom one is the only copy I've seen of the 797. Okay, next, Mike. It's a very interesting cachet done by Marion Fulton. She started in 1936. This was her second cachet. She started working with Breswick in doing cachets. But the interesting thing about this one is that Igel Halverson did a virtually identical cachet at the same time. Although Halverson's version, the lettering is slightly different. I mean, you notice this is a very specific style with the separations between the letters. but Hamilton did it in exactly the same place. The map of Rhode Island are virtually identical. They were both doing it at the same time. Don't know how that happened. Did one copy the other? But it's tough to tell. But this is Marion Fulton. And of course, she used a little bit different colors than Halverson did. Fulton, again, was one of the significant cachet artists at this time. Did covers for quite a while. Next slide, Mike. Two more examples of Fulton's work. The example on top for the SPA convention is her normal style, done in watercolors. Most of the cachets of hers that you find will be this style and this size, clearly limited on the left-hand side of the cover, but done in a very quick painting brush style with watercolors. The bottom is a presidential set. She did a complete presidential set. Fairly good portraiture. As many of you will be aware, doing portraits is one of the hallmarks of a good artist, a really good artist. And here she has, this series had all the presidents on it, and her portraiture work is pretty good. Next, please. Another cachet maker that started in the 30s, 1936. Risco. I'm sure you're all familiar with Risco, the airbrush. The technique was later perfected by Kendall Bevel. The style basically used cardboard cutouts, and then the airbrush would be sprayed over the cutout to leave the design on the cover. This is their second and third cachets. Note the lack of any black lines defining the borders of the images. Next cachet, Mike. Note, here's a Risco. Note the difference that a few defining lines make. This is one of my favorites. Again, I think it's just a gorgeous cachet. It's got a nice, delicate feel to it, but the line work makes the design far superior. Okay, next line, please. Here's a cachet maker insignificant that you have likely never heard of. I include him because his artwork is, I think, rather spectacular. The artist is Harold Colbert. And this was one of his earlier cachets. Mckay will recognize this because he's the one that sold it to me. He had the entire Army-Navy set, or most of them, but he wasn't interested in the Navy one. So I got lucky and was able to buy it. But the battle between Bonhomme Richard and the British ship Serapis, Bonhomme Richard, I'm sure you recall, was a gift to the Americans from the French. The Americans converted it into a warship. Bonhomme Richard only had about 25 gun placements. Serapis, a British man of war, had about 50 guns. John Paul Jones realized he was badly outgunned. What did he do? He strapped the two ships together. They're lashed together. You'll note that there's actually two ships on the left-hand side there. The flags, you can see the American flag on the stern of the back ship. Thank you, Mike. And the British flag on the stern of the one in front. The third ship is also an American ship. It was in the battle, firing at both of them and doing as much damage to Bonhomme Richard as was done to Serapis. Well, John Paul Jones, bless his heart, he and his Marines, with the ships strapped together, took control of Serapis. They boarded Serapis, Bonhomme Richard was sunk, and John Paul Jones captained the British ship into port. One of the great naval victories and a great story, but here captured, I think, in a magnificent artistic fashion. Note the address, Miss Shirley Colbert. That was Harold's daughter. You will find Dorothy Knapp cachets that are addressed to Shirley Colbert. They were obviously commissioned by her father, who only did cachets for his personal use and for his daughter. Next slide, Mike. This was also done by Harold Colbert. And in my opinion, keep in mind, this is pre-1940. In my opinion, this is the single best piece of art on a cover pre-1940. I mean, as gorgeous as Laffert's art is, it's a totally different style and nothing that would compare to this as an artistic measure. The hill, the hill and bridge, which looks almost like a photograph, that's all hand painted. The cameo, which is better than the cameo on the stamp, is just superb. And the Civil War soldier, Martin Van Buren Colbert, was Harold's father. He painted this for his daughter, Shirley M. Colbert, for a family heirloom, obviously, for his Civil War father, who was captured during the war. By the way, the hill and the bridge that you see in the picture was identified for me by a Civil War expert as one of the battles, and the battle where Harold was captured and was sent to Andersonville. If you know anything about Civil War history, Andersonville has got an evil reputation. They had about 38,000 prisoners, perhaps 10 to 12,000 of them survived the war. But Harold Colbert, a cachet maker you never heard of, is perhaps the best artist of them all, at least prior to 1940. Okay, next, Mike. Now, 1943, May Wiggin. Cover on top. It's identified or considered to be a Wiggin. Who painted it is unknown. Wiggins' initials are not on the bottom left corner. You'll note on the bottom cover, the initials are MW, as Wiggin often included her initials on her cachets. But as you know, many of May Wiggins' cachets were painted by other people, including Dorothy Knapp. And the question is whether Knapp designed this. Very likely it looks like a Knapp design. It certainly got the cloud feature, which was Dorothy's, at this time, developing in 1943, a part of her developing design statute. But the cover is addressed to Wiggin. It clearly was commissioned by her. She's a cachet maker, and the initials, according to Doug Weiss, the specific style of that initial indicates that it was not painted by Dorothy Knapp. Dorothy Knapp did paint some Wiggin covers, and Dorothy put May's initials on the cover to separate it from her own, but it's a different style of initial. Okay, next, Mike. Again, two more Wiggin covers. May was, again, a significant cachet maker and dealer. The top, she often heralded the female form, as you can also see in the bottom cover. May's initials are on the top cover. They're not in the bottom cover, but it's addressed to Wiggin, so we know it's hers. Again, notice both designs. It's possible that Knapp had something to do with the design using the cloud feature, which was Dorothy's. Okay, next slide, Mike. Another significant cachet maker. We're now into the 40s, 1944, Herman Mall. The top one is an add-on, including an add-on because Mall didn't start until 44. The bottom cover, a good example of his artistic style and coloring, as well as his handwriting and hand printing. That's Mall's printing on the address. And again, most of Mall's covers had patriotic themes. And some of the many cartoon-like caricatures, very popular and fun cachet maker. Next, Mike. These are covers that were reused. They were created initially by Cap Flugel. Ludwig Staley did the artwork. You can see Staley's signature. The covers, blank covers, were obviously sold when Cap went out of business in 1968, 69. But I included them. They're not hand painted, but they are printed. And printed magnificently. 5-color offset printing, especially including the use of silver. Definitely great examples of the best printers' art. And the important point and the reason why I included them is that they're good examples of colored printing that was profitable. Cap Flugel was into making profit. That was his business. And he was able to put these out, his headache series, if you will, for World War II, but make a profit. So one asks, or tends to ask, at least I ask myself, where is all the color? Why isn't there more printed color? Printed color in the 30s, in the 40s, in the 50s. Very scarce. Okay, next cachet. W.N. Wright, another major cachet maker during this period, very significant. Hand-painted, fully hand-painted covers. The top is his first that he did for the Roosevelt series. If you know this series, the 3 cent is the one dated first. The 1, the 2, and the 5 are all dated after this. So this is Wright's first cachet, and a gorgeous cachet that he did for the USF Constitution, old Ironsides. Okay, next, Mike. 2 more Wright covers. His style developed to where he used a banner. A banner became part of his design concepts, both for the Gutenberg Bible issue, and then the bottom cover, he did the entire Liberty series. I've yet to find the $5 cover, but I know it exists. But Wright did that series, and it's certainly one of the better cachets for that series. Okay, next, Mike. Next cachet, 1945, an insignificant cachet maker, yet I think a wonderful artist, Walter Stalwazouski. If any of you are Polish, please forgive my pronunciation, but he did about, I don't know, half a dozen or more cachets just for a short period of time. But they're gorgeous. At least I think they are. His use of color. The artwork is a little bit primitive on the top one. The bottom is pretty sophisticated. Next, a cachet that I think is stunning. 1945, J.T. Dyer, the fellow who's on the address, did a series of covers that carried the signatures of World War II generals. This one is signed by General Wainwright. If you know your World War II history, he is the hero of Bataan, Philippines, who fought bravely and was captured, unfortunately, by the Japanese at the beginning of the war. He was the highest ranking U.S. officer to be captured by the Japanese, and received the Medal of Honor for his service. But this cover, the artwork on that flag is just stunning. Notice the detail in the stars, the way he's done all of the individual stars, that the way they would seem as the flag is waving. And of course, the ripples in the flag work, the highlight, the light, some of the white highlights to indicate where the sun is. Yes. Magnificent, magnificent artwork. But again, there's very few of his covers. They were done more personally, not for profit. And there's very, very few of them around. But if you can get a hold of one, they're a welcome addition to any collection. Okay, next, please, Mike. Now, this fellow, you may or may not have heard of Bob Bolton, Robert Bolton. An interesting fellow, very much like Ralph Dyer. He was born in 1901, and he lived until 2001 or 2002. I'm not sure the exact date of his death. But at one point, he was probably the oldest cachet maker or stamp collector, because I believe he outlived Ralph Dyer by a few months at least. Bolton was a very interesting fellow. He made cachets in over 7 decades, or in 7 decades. He starred in over 50 silent movies, had a contract with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. He is probably the most decorated, and by decorated, I mean awarded artist of all the cachet artists ever. He received many awards from the National Academy of the Arts, received multiple awards for the work he did in designing sets and exhibits for various national companies. His artwork hangs in collections like Princess Grace of Monaco, Grand Duchess Romanovsky, and the Rockefeller art collections. So he is an internationally known artist. This is his first cachet on the top. Notice the detail and color. I mean, this guy is good. The cachet on the bottom, again, excellent artwork. But Bolton's style, next, Mike, please. Yeah, he normally used a 5 1/4 by 7 1/4 envelope, the same size that Carol Gordon used. And the first 2 covers you saw were 2 of only 3 number 6 cachets that he did, because most all of Bolton's cachets are on this side cover. Again, he did multiple cachets for Canada. One of the American artists, along with Carol Gordon and Nigel Halverson, who did covers for Canadian stamps. Next cachet, Mike, or next slide, I'm sorry. This, I think, is a very simple and elegant cachet for Queen Elizabeth in honor of her, who was at the time the Duchess of Edinburgh. Next slide. Note the different styles. This is again Bob Bolton. But what a delightful, playful, colorful cachet. Okay, next slide, Mike. Now this one I included, again, it's along the line of color printing that was rarely seen. It doesn't have the Artcraft emblem on it, but this is an Artcraft cover done in 1949. And to my examination, it is the only multiple color printed cachet by Artcraft. Now I say multiple colors, at least 4 colors or more. There are Christmas cachets that Artcraft did, in 2 color. But the question becomes, why? Why did Artcraft not do more color cachets? Obviously, their engraved monochrome cachets were successful. And of course, if they sell, there's no reason to fix it if it ain't broken. So perhaps the answer is simply just a matter of taste. People preferred the monocolor, 2-color on occasion cachet. But this is the only Artcraft that I could find. And on cost, this cover was used by the Washington and Lee Bicentennial Commission as a fundraiser. So that means they paid Artcraft whatever Artcraft wanted, and they were able to sell the cover for enough to make a profit for their fundraiser. You know how much they sold it for? 25 cents. And at 25 cents, they were making a profit. So the printing cost must have been well within line to make color printing possible. Okay, we now go into a period of a wasteland of color in the 40s, in the 50s, and the 60s, and into the mid-70s. Except for the covers that were created throughout this period by Wright, Dyer, and printed covers by Flugel, during this 50s, 60s, early 70s period, there's virtually no other color, except for Dr. Morris Noble, who started in 1952. He created or did cachets into, I believe, early 1960. These are by his first artist, Paula Bogert, who is a pretty good artist, as you can tell. Check out the next cachet. This is a Noble cachet. It just takes my breath away. The image is the Great Wave off of Kanagawa. And the original art was a woodcut print by Katsushika Hokusai, who was one of the most famous classic Japanese artists. This is not an exact reproduction, but it's pretty close. And I'd say it's pretty magnificent. Definitely one of the most beautiful cachets I've seen. Okay, next. I said it was virtually a wasteland as far as new cachet makers coming into the painted or color painted cachet market during the 50s, the 60s, and the early 70s. Something happened in 1976 that changed the cachet field forever. Perhaps some of you are a little ahead of me and you realize that in 1976, Professor Earl Planty copyrighted his encyclopedia, his photo encyclopedia of first day covers. Watch what happens after 1976. The first we come to in 1976 is Claude C. Reese, founder of our chapter, number 48, the American First Day Cover Society. Claude was a Marine who lost his legs in the Battle of Iwo Jima, was in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. Claude did a lot of very creative cachets. The one on top is his example of early American architecture. Claude had a great sense of humor. He has another one for early American architecture of a cartoon character holding up his pants running to the outhouse. And the outhouse is the example of early American architecture. The cover on the bottom I included because Claude did many different things for cachets, a lot of paste-on cachets. If any of you collect a Christmas topical, I've got some lovely, gorgeous Christmas covers done by Claude. But the cover on the bottom I wanted to point out is hand tinted by Claude. Now this is a cachet craft cover designed by L.W. Staley, but the color has been added by Claude, and I think makes a beautiful, beautiful cachet. The important thing is that on the back of the cover, Claude signed and dated that the cachet was painted by Claude C. Reese in 1980. And therein lies the key to so many debates we have about add-ons and what artists should do. And the bottom line is what Jim McCusker told Curtis Poorman. When Curtis was starting to do his cachets, Jim said, sign it and date it. Sign it and date it, fully disclose, and let the buyer be an informed buyer so a buyer can decide if he wants to buy an add-on or not. And therein, it's a basic fundamental of legal fairness, full disclosure, sign and date. Nothing wrong with tinting, hand tinting someone else's art, as long as you own it, which Claude did. He was meticulous. I have about 5 or 6 different cachets that Claude has hand tinted, but he signed and dated all of them, a man of integrity. So for those of you like myself who might enjoy coloring a cover once in a while, just sign it and date it, and no one will ever say anything. Okay, next, Mike. Again, remember we are now post-Planty, 1977. Lois Hamilton. The top is her first cachet. A delightful little piece. Lois is a really good artist. The bottom cover, delicate, exquisite is the term that comes to my mind. course, the cover's been used again, as you'll note by the bottom cancel, but the bottom line is Lois Hamilton. Next slide. An example, a more complex design by Lois Hamilton, 1988. But again, gorgeous cover. Wonderful use of color and design. 1977. Another artist that began in 1977, Doris Gold. Prominent member of the Claude C. Reese chapter. The top cachet is one of her earlier cachets done in 1978. This is a style where she printed the black line art and the printing, the Captain James Cook at the top, but then hand colored and created pretty decent looking cachet. Bottom, oh, note, I'm sorry, on the top cover, note that there is no numbering. Note that of all the covers I've shown you so far up to this point, there's no numbering like we see nowadays, 1 of 30. Standard numbering like artists did with fine art prints. But up to this point, there is none. The bottom cover, done in 1989, it's numbered 43 of 145. And Doris began her signature touch of gold. You'll see the little gold blot under the astronauts, just to the right of the astronaut's foot. There you go. Thank you, Mike. That was her touch of gold. But Doris didn't start. She's not the one who started with the numbering system. I'll get to that in a little bit. Okay, next, Mike. Again, 2 more Doris Gold covers that show another innovation by Doris. The top one, Peter Martin, a thank you cover. Note the Rudolph's nose. And on the bottom cover, note the eye of the duck. It's a sequin. It's a little red sequin that she has glued to the cover to just add a little bit of something extra to make people happy and enjoy. But again, Doris, pretty good artist. Okay, next, Mike, please. And here we come to the perhaps, or arguably, or maybe factually, the most popular or best-selling, of course, not considering art craft, which is a different genre, but the best-selling of the multicolored cachets, Fred Collins. Now, Fred Collins made cachets for over 40 years, and he's still going strong. Started in 1978. And I just signed up to get one of his duck covers. He's still doing duck covers, at least, as far as I know, he's still producing other cachets. Note the simplicity of the top cover, which is his first cachet. And as you know, Fred's business model, what he developed, was what we discussed back in the first session of the Civil War covers. Remember the Civil War covers, the Magnus Civil War covers that were created with a black line print, and then people were paid a penny a cover in order to do the covering, the coloring, to fill it in. That's Fred Collins's model, and that's exactly what he did. Printed in a black line, and then it was filled in. The top cover is very simple. There's no shading involved, just the color itself, just as a child would color with crayons. A little more sophisticated. I don't mean to say this is childish, but that was his initial style. It quickly developed into more complex designs, as indicated in the bottom cover, which is one that I suspect most of you would not have identified as a Collins cover. It definitely has a different look to it, but it is Collins, and it's signed by him. Mike, I don't know if you can point out, right above the N in Exposition is where he signed it. It's definitely a Collins cover. Okay, next, this is Collins' more recent style. The top cover is his latest duck cover for 2020. And the bottom cover is a state duck cover. Now, Collins is perhaps the preeminent cachet maker doing duck covers. He has done every federal duck cover since 1981, which means he's done, well, the one coming up will be his 40th for 40 years. The bottom cover has an interesting story. Fred also did covers for the various state permits that were the states picked up after they saw how much the federal government was making off the federal duck covers. This is the first of state. It's the first state cover done for New Mexico. The story that is a little bit interesting is that New Mexico had the stamps or permit, whatever you want to call it, printed in San Francisco. Well, on the date that the cover was to be issued, there were no stamps in the state of New Mexico. They were printed, but they were in San Francisco. So Fred arranged to have stamps airplaned or sent by air to New Mexico in time to be canceled in Albuquerque on their date of issue, September 30th. But imagine the administrative headache in getting those stamps, buying them, getting them on a plane, getting them to New Mexico into the hands. But the result was that, according to Fred, this is the only cachet cover that was done for New Mexico's first duck permit stamp. Okay, next please, Mike. We now come to our bookend. Our bookends being Dorothy Knapp and Freda Dickey Weaver. And of all the cachet makers, Freda and her husband, John Weaver, perhaps been more, well, should I say, instrumental in advancing the art on cover concept. Again, as I mentioned, Freda was not a stamp collector. John was. Freda was a fabulous artist, as we all know. What they did was not only to start Freda making first day covers in 1979. The cover on top is her first. And note the detail, the dog's hair, the grass, just the detail. And it is absolutely a realistic portraiture of a German Shepherd. But what Freda and John did that was so significant, they lived in Colorado, in Estes Park, Colorado, which was a bit of an art colony, kind of like Laguna Beach, California, Taos, New Mexico. Many artists lived there, and many artists were having trouble surviving there. They would go to weekend art shows being held at a mall or who knows wherever art shows could be sold where local artists were selling their art. And they would pick out a quality artist, someone who both Freda and John agreed, hey, this is a pretty good artist. And they would then introduce the artist, if you will, to cachets, and suggested that painting cachets and selling them, they could do better than they were doing with their weekend sales at the mall. And they found and mentored, John mentored these artists, none of them were collectors, over 15 different artists who became collectively known as the Colorado Connection because they were all from the Colorado area. Artists like Curtis Porman, Michelle Mckay, Art Colbert, Lynn Cloud, Laura Bender, Ron and Pat Beller, Pat Roman, Jeannie Horak. These are all fabulous artists, and I will get to them in edition number 3, which I call the golden age of first day covers. Freda and John Weaver were the dawn of this period, and they started it. And all of these artists, the ones that I mentioned and more, were very successful in selling their artwork, reproducing it and selling it through the cachet medium. For example, one example that comes off the top of my head is Michelle Mckay, who was an artist since she was a little girl in New Jersey. She knew she wanted to do art. She left home as a young woman, went to Colorado just to be an artist. And she was working in order to buy food, pay her rent. She was working at cleaning houses. That's how passionate she was about her art. But after she met the Weavers and started making cachets, she did very well and clearly made more money than she was as a house cleaner. And the sadder part of the story, or the irony of the story, is that after doing it for about 20 years, the market slowly decreased and has died down, and she went back to cleaning houses and selling her design cards. But here we have Freda's first 2 cachets. On the back of the cover, they were signed and dated and numbered, not dated, they were signed and numbered by Freda. John Weaver and Freda Weaver are the ones who started the numbering of the covers, similar to the way fine art duplications were done by artists like Dolly, and you're familiar with that market. But John and Freda were the one who started the numbering, which is now the norm rather than the exception. Okay, next slide. The hallmark of Freda's work is research and detail. Every one of Freda's cachets is researched, and researched. The design that she shows is an absolute accurate portraiture of an Indian dancer wearing the masks that are honored on the stand. Detail in the artwork, you can see each individual blade of grass down below at the dancer's feet. Oh, thank you, Mike. Yeah. each individual blade of grass, each bead on the outfit is perfectly placed and properly placed. Magnificent, magnificent detailed art. Okay, next slide, Mike. Here is one of the designs from her transportation series. And I wanted to show you this one for a specific reason. Mike, will you blow up the bumper, please, and the license plate? Here we go. Note the license plate. Those are the initials of Freda's customer, JTM. And we know that from a note that was in this cover where she's just writing a little thank you to the customer and saying, please note the license plate. And it's clear that the initials are the customer's initials. But now look below the bumper. First, right, go to the right, Mike, where the jack hole is. You see that detail where she's got the insert for the jack to go in case it's needed? And look at the detail in the undercarriage. Just a bare hint of the undercarriage, but it's what one would actually see if you were standing in the position to view the car at this angle. And Freda's research was that precise, and her painting in detail that precise to include that detail. Look at the tread on the tires. Genuine reproduction of what I believe they're Kelly tires, what they look like. They might be Firestones, but amazing, amazing detail. And this is the hallmark of Freda Dickey Weaver. Okay, next, Mike, please. Again, the detail becomes incredible, especially when you consider that this cover was painted, actually painted, 30 years after the date. Freda painted it for me in 2018. Note the detail of every piece of the pine needles. Note the detail in the feathers on the wing. And this is painted by a woman who I believe is in her 80s. I'm not sure exactly of Freda's age. The feathers in the neck. This is incredible artwork, incredible detail, and particularly considering Freda's age. And again, one last concept. This was put on the covers 30 years after the cover was serviced. Do we call it an add-on? I hope not. I hope not. I'm an advocate for the concept that if an artist serviced a cover with the intent to paint it, that it makes no difference when the painting is is put on the cover. It's not to be considered an add-on. Kendall Bevel did many cachets for the Celebrate the Century series 10, 15 years or more after they were serviced. Okay, next cover. Next slide, please. An unashamed, unabashed advertisement, folks. But it fits right in place because 1980 was the year that Carol Gordon began. And to finish off this time frame, before we get into the golden age of cachet makers, Carol Gordon, 1980 The book has been created by Susan Bonnet Jones by the Reese chapter. It is for sale. You can buy it at the Great American Stamp Show. I can tell you that the printing and the color reproductions are exceptional. And whether you are a Carol Gordon collector or not, I believe that her cachets, along with those of Laffert, Knapp, Weaver, will be the cachets that are going to be collected in the next 100 years. That will be desirable. Carol's cachets, when you start to get into them and understand them, are absolutely incredible in their quality and substance. And I believe she is a cachet maker. Along, I should mention Dave Bennett, whose cachets also, I think, will survive the test of time. But I strongly recommend the book to you. You can get it at the Great American Stamp Show for a $5 discount, or you can find the advertisement in your latest version of First Days and send a check to Mike Luzzi and get a copy. Finishing off with two of Carol's cachets. Next slide, Mike. One of mine, just a very playful, delightful, colorful cachet. Unusual, you bet. Unusual, I believe she based it on a Persian painting, but I could be wrong on that. But the book tells you what it's based on, because Susan included a lot of background and history to the cachet art and its significance, historical significance. This is one cachet, and another, the next one, Mike. Again, very unusual. $14 eagle, but the artwork is exceptional in its style, in its design, in its detail. And I'll tell you something, this particular cover was done with a colored pencil. Done with a colored pencil. Now, I'm not a great knowledge of media and the things that are available art, but there are colored pencils and then there are colored pencils. Apparently professional colored pencils, well, there's a reason why they're professional colored pencils, but this is done with colored pencil. Hard to believe. Okay, that finishes the presentation. Another unashamed and unabashed advertisement for AFDCS, which is well placed and well considered. That is it. And Mike, I guess if you have questions, I will answer them.
So Mike, if you want to go run through the chat room questions and comments, let's start there.
I just have a couple. Foster, I don't know if you want to chime in with yours.
Okay.
Foster know that he has a copy of the 797 Wagner, so there's at least two that exist.
Do I have a copy of, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, Mike.
He said that Foster has a copy of the 797 Wagner, so at least two of those exist.
Oh, well, thank you for the information. That's not surprising. As I said, I've never seen another copy, but then we have two each of the two Wagner cachets.
I believe the one I have came from the Eldon Moeller collection.
Oh, of course Foster would have it. That's one of your specialties, isn't it, Foster?
That is correct.
Yep. Yep. And you got it from Eldon?
I believe I got it in the Eldon Mower auction, was it November 2019, the one he did it, one they did that Doug Harmer did at Nojex.
No, you had a lot of great covers.
Took a lot of my money.
Yes, that's one of the necessary evils, isn't it?
Then I know you
Okay.
noted too, Foster, about Shirley Culver, the addressee on many of those Knapp one-of-a-kinds as well.
Bob mentioned it later on, but guess right after the pandemic hit, Doug Weiss bought a run of 300 one-of-a-kind Dorothy Knapps that were addressed to Shirley Culver.
Yes.
And many of them were placed in our collections. I got a 797 that was previously not known. There's now 3 different Dorothy Knapps for the issue. I have 2 of the 3. And Doug will gladly tell you about the time I turned down the second one, thinking it was the design I already had. And a decade later, he reminds me I should have bought it, and he's absolutely correct.
Well, what I noticed when I went through Doug's book on Dorothy Knapp, that the designs that she did for Mr. Colbert, or the covers that are addressed to Shirley and Colbert, are generally different designs than her regular design for whatever that issue was. And so I'm not surprised if the conclusion is that, yes, they're all unique.
There's 300 more that weren't in the catalog.
300 more that were not in the catalog.
That was I believe it was Shirley Culver's granddaughter or someone in the family. He bought them from March of last year. 300 new Dorothy Knapp designs.
Oh my Lord. Oh my Lord. You know, there was an article in First Days, and I'm forgetting the name of the fellow who wrote it, but the article was about him being at a show. The author was at a show, and this elderly couple were selling or trying to sell hand-painted First Day covers to a dealer. And he overheard the conversation and quickly got the idea that the dealer was taking advantage of their lack of knowledge. And he apparently somehow intervened and let the couple know that they were about to be flummoxed and that perhaps they might consider more realistic avenues of release or sale. And I think ultimately the covers, he showed many covers in the article, and the covers that he showed, 2 of them were by Harold Colbert. The one cover that I showed you of the John Paul Jones, a battle of Bonhomme Richard and Serapis, as well as several other covers done by Colbert. And it also showed a couple of Knapp covers that were addressed to Shirley and Colbert. But that may have been the couple that now had these 300 unique Knapps. That's very interesting. It'd be fascinating to see if you can get into the sale, but you can't really identify the people without breaching privacy concerns and everything else. But it would appear.
I believe, if I remember right, Doug told me it was like a granddaughter, but with some relative in the Culver family who did know that he was the leading expert in Dorothy Knapp covers, and contacted him, and he made the purchase. You know, I got the 797. I believe Roland Berger got 2 Virginia Dare ones.
Well, I know from my research and the article, I did an article that's printed in the American Philatelist on Harold Colbert. And it's a discovery of that cover of the second one I showed you, the Civil War, with the cameo of Lincoln on it. In doing that research, Shirley Culver's mother lived to be well over 90, okay? Which means that she was still around in the 1980s, 1990s, and it could have been her or perhaps Shirley who was selling the covers that were now retired, and we're selling the collection because that's too big a coincidence. I bought the Lincoln cover from who was Gil Shelley? Lou Kaufman, from Lee Kaufman at a show in California, and he had apparently just gotten it. Of course, no one had ever seen it. I showed it to about Mike Litvak was with me at the time when I bought it, and no one had ever seen this cover or anything like it. It was incredible. So the discovery, the path of learning out about, or learning and discovering Harold, was a very interesting path. And the article, if anyone is curious about it, it's in the June of 2014. Yeah, the June 2014 issue of American Philatelist, the AP, and it's a fascinating path of discovery because Martin Culver, the Civil War soldier, went off the grid, off the information grid after the Civil War, and could not be found anywhere. I had David Zabatsky helping me look for Martin Van Buren Culver, and we discovered his military records. We discovered his military records. He was, part of the Connecticut Volunteers. But that whole story of figuring out who it was, at first we thought, I got down the list and felt that Shirley might have been the artist, but then we found census records indicating that Shirley was only 5 years old. But from the census records, we learned that Harold was an engraver. And any of you who know Czesław Słania, as an engraver, you know the artistic talent that's involved there. And that clearly was Harold who was the artist. So wow, 300 more. Oh my Lord. That's amazing. That's amazing. Perhaps those covers will be included in a supplement to Dorothy Knapp's book. Yeah.
Bob, this is Peter
Yes.
LaPlaca. I have Tony Dewey and I are writing a book on 772. We have 5 Culver covers of 772. So I don't know which is
772, wait, that's the Michigan issue?
a Connecticut issue. Connecticut.
Okay.
So what is the first cover we did?
What is the first cover he did?
Yeah.
Don't know. I mean, your guess is as good as mine. I've seen very few Harold Colbert covers since we learned who he was. And I know Jim McCusker had several in an auction, and they were Michigan for the Michigan stamp. They were Michigan covers. So if you have 772, then that predates
Right, we have five different covers.
Yeah, very possible. Very possible, but I'll bet they're all different designs.
Yes, they are.
Yeah, they're all, each one was, I believe, unique with him. And again, he was painting for personal pleasure, and for his daughter, at least
Right.
something for his daughter.
There were history lessons for his daughter.
But I haven't seen any, I certainly haven't seen anything by him prior to 772. So that could very well be his first. But
And we also have five Schullerman covers. We
Pardon?
also have five Schullerman covers from 772.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm sorry for the break. I'm in a hospital bed right now, so I can't show you them.
Would you mind making me a scan and emailing that to me of those 772 covers?
Not at all. I will write it down and do it when I get home tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Are we done then?
Just gotten a couple questions. There is a recording available of part one for those that have asked, and we'll get a link out for that. And then there will be a recording of this one as well to watch back. So for anybody that's interested or may have missed it. So I made note of who it was so I can get it off to you directly if it's not on the website.
If anyone needs the link, just send me an email. I sent it out to several people within the last week when we announced this session. I can just cut and paste it in an email. Or you can email Michael and I'll gladly let him do it.
So Bob, I have a question, Chris McIntosh.
Yes.
In the first part of your teaching back in May, you asked for scans of Halverson covers. In this presentation today, are there any cachet makers that you would like to see scans of that the attendees may own and they could send to you?
Only if not particularly for my purposes. The reason I asked for the Laffert covers was to help me do a census of how many he produced for each issue. It's become a burning question with many people beside myself. But no, but please send me scans of anything you have questions about. I've dealt with several people who want to identify covers, and I'm certainly glad to help. I don't know if I'll be able to always answer the question, but anyone who needs help or assistance, that's what I've gotten into in this stage of life. Now that I'm 95% retired, I just want to help educate. So if anyone has a particular cover they have questions about, I'll be glad to communicate with you.
Well, I think that was the last comment on the chat. Unless anybody has another question, I want to thank Bob for all of his time and the hours that it takes to put together the research for this presentation. I want to thank Mike for doing all of the PowerPoints and the screen share so that we can see the first day covers and the cachets in great detail. And
Thank you.
If
You're all welcome. You're all welcome.
If you
Hey,
are
Chris.
interested in more of these Zoom meetings, if you could email me, that would be great. And if you would like to volunteer to do such a presentation on something that you've collected and would like to share your knowledge, I'm always looking for other ideas. And so you can find me at KRISMC476@gmail.com. And I would love to have your ideas. I know Mike's going to do one on art craft for us. Bob's got another part 3 coming up. We have the Great American Stamp Show. If you get to go to that, there'll be lots of good educational opportunities there at that week. So thank you very much.
May I say one thing in closing? I see a young lady present who I want to absolutely give my thanks to, and every Reese chapter member. Sue Jones is present, and Sue, the job you did on that Gordon book is fabulous. We are enjoying it now that we've seen it. It's
Yeah, now that
awesome,
I've seen it and had some time off from making it, I'm kind of enjoying it too. And I'll be talking at the Great American Stamp Show about her.
Yes, yes.
At the AFDCS table. I think
Yep.
there's a whole bunch of them coming. I hope we go
Yep.
home with none of them. And you say $5?
Yeah, I really don't want to have her getting home.
Yes, Foster, and I would like you not to have to bring any to Sacramento,
Right.
because I have hundreds of them in my garage.
And is it possible to buy them online through the chapter website?
You just need to contact me directly. We do not take credit cards or anything like that. You mail me a check and I will mail them out.
Okay.
And you could go to the AFDCS website. The ad is there with all of my contact information.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Please order them.
Yes. Support your cachet makers every way that
Yes.
you can.
Yeah,
The show, so
And
I
your
don't have to take them back to Maryland with me.
yeah, Foster, sell them all. Sue will bring them to you.
And I'll be
Okay,
there.
Anybody have any other announcements?
For those attending Great American Stamp Show, we still have tickets available for the President's Banquet, where the top cachet contest winners from last year will be unveiled. And yes, we still have a lot of good hand painted stuff going on today. You can also make donations to support the show and order show covers, which were designed by Dave Bennett. Can't think of a better person to depict. I forget what the correct term for the I'll say animated animals playing the barnyard games. You can see the images on the AFDCS website. It's one of Dave's best designs. I think he left, but I think it's one of his. It's really hilarious design.
Thank you, Foster. And just as a show of hands, if you received an email announcement about this Zoom event, would you just raise your hand? Okay, there's lots of people that aren't on the video right now, but I think we started out with 79 people, Bob.
79.
And that's a
817 emails.
great start. So thank
Amazing.
you all very much.
Amazing how many people are into self-flagellation.
Unfortunately, that's true. All right, have fun with your collections.
Thank
Happy
you.
August.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Bob.
You are almost welcome. Wow.
At the end of part 3, we'll owe you a big dinner.
Oh, now you're talking my language.
We
will Right. work
I will work for food, you betcha.
Okay, bye, everybody.